Professor Scruton, what do you understand by the concept of libertarianism?
Libertarianism means many things, but principally in my understanding it's the view that the individual and his rights are more important than any collective enterprise, and that the main function of the state is to secure and protect the rights of the individual and to make sure that the rights of all citizens are satisfied as best as possible.
What do you understand by the concept of individualism?
Individualism, in my understanding, is a more philosophical idea. It's the view that societies are, in the end, composed of individuals, and individuals are the ultimate matter of human society, that each individual is in some sense complete in himself. He contains within himself all that's necessary for a fully personal existence. And this nature, this individual nature, is precisely what the state and government has to secure and to safeguard.
Thank you. What forces gave rise to the development of these ideologies?
It's a really very difficult historical question, when and how libertarianism and individualism became so prominent. Certain people argue that it was really an Enlightenment phenomenon during the late 17th and early 18th century, with the slow erosion of religious belief and people's commitment to a sort of transcendental order, that the idea of the human individual as the repository of all value and all that's worthwhile came into prominence. Others, like Marxists for instance, argue that these particular philosophies are essentially bourgeois. What they mean by that is that they come from the new kinds of property relations that followed on the collapse of feudal society, when people thought themselves as each man for his own in a world of pure competition and enterprise. I think all these sort of theories are probably much too simple. There's an element of individualism in the philosophy of the Greeks, in many of the philosophies of the Greeks anyway, and I think there's a tendency in all human beings to see themselves in something like this way. After all, I am an individual. I can't deny that, and I do have my own life to lead, and my rights are important to me. The only question is, to what extent can I think of myself as it were, purely the product of my own activity? To what extent I can renounce or deny my connections with others.
Thank you very much. In your opinion, what philosophical fallacies underpin the libertarian and individualist position?
I think that both positions, the libertarian and the individualist position, are both have a superficial plausibility, and there are elements of truth in them. But both of them neglect the fact that we are not born individuals, but we become individuals through a particular social process, the process of asserting ourselves in an environment of free competition. And what makes that process possible is the fact that we can trust each other, that we have relations of obligation and duty towards others, which others also have towards us. And it's there, the fact that others respect those obligations, that gives us the room, the moral space, as it were, in which to grow into individuals. But that means that in some deep sense, society and the order of society is prior to the individual. It's only because it is there that we can grow in this peculiar direction. And therefore I think that it's far from seeing society as the aggregate of individuals. One should see society as the collective entity which makes it possible for the individual to emerge. That's a very abstract way of putting it, but it's hard to put it more concretely. Okay, let me illustrate that abstract argument a little. In the modern world, we find a lot of people who do not identify themselves in this individualistic and libertarian way, who think of themselves primarily as members of communities. This is certainly true of most Africans, and also of most Arabs. They would see themselves, of course, as having individual aims and ambitions, but also as primarily owing their life and their happiness and everything that matters to them to a community of which they are a part. we Western Europeans have developed in a slightly different direction and tend to therefore to disregard our own need for community. But in fact, if you look at the matter, not only historically, but in the full social context, you'll see that we, just as much as the Africans and the Arabs, do require a sense of membership in an enterprise greater than ourselves. It's from that all our values and all our rewards are derived. We can't make our own rewards or make our own values. They are things which come to us because of our interaction with others.
Thank you. What mechanisms and institutions are required to create an effective society beyond individualism and the free market?
I'm a believer in the free market because I think, for reasons that have been made abundantly clear by people like Hayek, there is no other way of organising an economy to everybody's advantage. And we know from modern history that all attempts to do anything else leads to suffering and chaos. But that doesn't mean that the free market is the sole principle on which a society should be organised. It's the principle on which economic life should be organised, but economic life is only part of life. People don't only pursue profit and economic goods, they pursue happiness, they pursue religious values and moral order, they look for friendship with others. They want to unite with others in little communities, and this means that there are many more aspects to society than the market. There are clubs and institutions and churches, and there's the whole moral order, which is very difficult to define case by case, but which is of much greater importance to us than the mere accumulation of profit and avoidance of loss. And I think it's understanding these other aspects of human society which leads us to recognise that politics is far more complicated than the free marketeers would like us to believe. Politics must not only protect the free market, but also protect these other aspects of social life, which are repeatedly threatened, not only by exterior enemies, but also by individual anarchy within. To take an instance, pornography. The ideology of the market would say, well, look, this is something that people want, just like anything else. We should therefore liberate it and let people pursue it until the market itself ensures the distribution of pornographic materials according to people's desires. Now, of course, if that were all there were to pornography, just something that people happen to want, that would be fine. But a slightest reflection on the human condition, I think, will show us that pornography doesn't simply satisfy a desire. It also fundamentally changes human nature. It changes the nature of our sexual experience, changes therefore our attitude to each other, and strikes at the roots of social order by making relations between man and woman, or between man and man too, into matters of mere consumer gratification rather than matters of love and commitment. And that is an effect which no serious person can view with equanimity, and which the law has to take into account.
Thank you. Why should the individual obey the state?
The most difficult and important question of political philosophy is that of political obligation. The question why we should obey the state. What is our duty towards the state? I think there is no simple answer, but let me give a couple of suggestions. In my understanding, we must obey the state insofar as the state is legitimate, at least. We must obey it because it is the sole means that we have for reconciling each other's interests with and surviving together in the collective enterprise of social existence. There is nothing better that man has devised whereby to resolve conflicts and to keep us all together in all the complex and changing circumstances of social life. So that, for just on purely utilitarian grounds, we have an obligation to obey the state. But I think there are perhaps also deeper reasons to be found. The standard libertarian and individualist answer is that we obey the state because we have undertaken some kind of social contract to do so. And this is the classical answer of Rousseau and Locke and all their successors. The reason why individualists and liberals think in that way is because they cannot accept the idea of an obligation which hasn't been undertaken by the person upon whom it's imposed. And if you have an obligation to do something, it's because you, in some sense, have contracted to it, so that the obligation becomes an expression of your individual freedom. Now, I believe that there is no way in which you can make sense of the obligation to the state as a merely contractual obligation. Contractual obligations are obligations that we can get out of by rewriting the contract, getting other people to agree to the rewriting of it, at least. There are also obligations that we undertake consciously. Now, our obligation to the state was there before we were even capable of forming a contract. When we were children, it was still there. We were born into this social condition and into the state which is part of it. It's absurd to think that the obligations that we have towards it, therefore, are obligations merely of contract. They are more like obligations, as the Romans would have said, of piety. Obligations which stem from the gratitude that we must and do feel towards those good things which made it possible for us to exist in the first place.
Thank you very much. In contemporary British economics, what restrictions would you seek to impose on the free market?
I think, yes, the question of how the free market should be restricted is a very interesting and difficult one, and people give different answers. I believe that the socialists are wrong in their view, which is that the free market must be restricted in order to produce social justice. I don't think that social justice, for a start, is a very coherent idea, and all the attempts to achieve it by restricting the market have led to far greater injustices and inequalities as well than we have witnessed in ordinary market economies. Everybody can witness this if they want to by travelling in the former communist countries or in those countries which still are communist. But I do believe, nevertheless, that there is a sense in which the market must be restricted. That is to say, there are areas of social life which shouldn't simply be left to the regulation of market forces. I've mentioned already pornography, and I think that's a very important example. Human sexual behaviour generally, because it touches on our deepest commitments, on ideas of the sacred and even of the eternal. Because of that, this cannot possibly be regulated through merely market forces. The result would be utter chaos. It is utter chaos, and this is one of the greatest catastrophes that are looming over human civilization, I believe. But that is only one area. I think there are other areas of social life which we have never really regulated themselves through market forces. Culture generally is one of them. Culture, in our modern understanding of it, of high culture, of music, art and theatre and so on, has always depended on patronage. It's never been able to survive simply by the market regulating the distribution of benefits to the artist and his entourage. There's always been some element of, at least of private patronage in the past, and during our century the state has taken that over. I'm not saying that the state is the best or the most natural guardian of the arts. Indeed, I think it isn't. And it's not a very good guardian of anything very much. But nevertheless, there is a public duty for the maintenance of some cultural continuity in a modern society, which I think cannot be fulfilled simply by allowing the market to take its way. Those are just two examples. I think if you extrapolate from them, you'll find that there are many, many other areas in which the market clearly isn't the prime regulator of human affairs.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I think I've been into this, but I'll just say one thing about it. Economic freedom is, I believe, a necessity, because without economic freedom there is no real economy. If you look at those countries in the world where there is no economic freedom, the communist countries until recently, it was still the case that their economies, insofar as they existed in those little areas of freedom that had been left. The black market, the underground economy. As soon as you take away economic freedom, you take away all economics. So freedom is the essential precondition for any form of prosperity. But in other areas of human life, of course, freedom might mean the end of social order, not rather than the beginning of it, and the end of all the good things that we want, and not rather than the premise from which those good things flow. Now, in the case of the legalization of drugs, many people give this as an instance. If you allow freedom in this area, they say, of course, you're opening the way to a complete social collapse. Actually, I think that is true of pornography. I'm not so clear about drugs. I think, again, I have a certain sympathy for the libertarian approach. But I think it has to be qualified. If you give people the freedom to take drugs like heroin, you must also take away the duty to look after them, so that you should make it entirely their responsibility what happens to them. And with any luck, their taking these drugs will lead very quickly to their extinction. And that seems to me rather a good idea.
Thank you very much. How, in your view, should changes be brought about within society?
Changes in modern societies should, I think, be divided into two different kinds. There are those which come about and should come about spontaneously, in particular changes in social institutions, in the forms of social life. And there are those which come about through changes in the law. Now, changes which come about through changes in the law are, in a sense, imposed from above. And I think that it is extremely important, therefore, that these should not come about without a considerable forethought. Laws which affect social organisation and social conduct, because they are going to involve herding people in new directions, should be rare. There should be considerable argument and public discussion before they're ever embarked upon. And in general, it seems to me, there's probably too much attempt in the modern world to change human societies by legislative means, and not enough to allow societies to adjust themselves to the changing circumstances of history. And I think, again, this is one point that the free marketeers and the individualists have emphasised rightly, which is that modern societies have been subjected to far too much legislation, attempts to remake them in the image of this or that half-baked utopia, and usually with the result of considerable disorientation and often genuine suffering on the part of the ordinary people themselves. So I do believe that the primary means of social change must always be the spontaneous regeneration and adaptation of social institutions, and not the introduction of legislation.
Thank you very much. The British state has grown enormously over the past 150 years, both in its size and in the areas it seeks to control. To what extent has this process been a beneficial one?
The growth of the state since the Industrial Revolution has been seen by many people as inevitable, because societies have suddenly become extremely mobile from the point of view of the labour market, from the point of view of economy, and from many other points of view too. People are shifting around constantly, forming new groups and new enterprises all the time. And in order to control this massive transformation, it's been inevitable that a central administration has been relied upon. This has happened everywhere. And this doesn't mean that all the growth that has occurred has been either natural or beneficial. And I again agree with the libertarians that much of the growth of the state has been actually malevolent. That is because the state has a tendency to expand into areas where it is not competent. It's not competent to deal with economic matters. It's not competent to deal with the structure of private life. It's not competent to control institution building. Nor, in my view, is it really competent to control education. And it's the growth of the state sector in the education in this country which has led to the ultimate collapse of our schools. So I do believe that there are many areas of social life which are best conducted without the state taking a part in them. Unfortunately, it's as we know from Parkinson's law, which is perhaps the mildest version of it, there is an intrinsic tendency in bureaucracies not only to grow but to take over new areas. And this is the most important fight that the free marketeers have conducted, and I approve of it wholeheartedly. The attempt to reclaim many of the areas where the state is not competent, either to administer things or to lay down the law, and I fully sympathise with that.
Thank you very much. What duties does the individual have, which, in your opinion, he should place before his own interests?
The individual has duties not only towards the state but to all members of society. They are defined by morality, they are defined also by religion, and they're defined by his own personal history. Each person has a duty towards their parents and their children, towards their friends, towards the clubs and societies they belong to. And these duties come naturally to us. None of us have any difficulty in understanding them. The duty to the state is only one small section of the sum total of our social duties. And it's one of the lamentable facts of modern life that people tend to put their rights before their duties. But in my view, you can only claim rights if you're willing to answer to your duties first.
Thanks very much. How, in your opinion, should a conservative government or society deal with those individualists and libertarians who would not conform to its values?
The problem of the non-conformist is an age-old one. First of all, there are those who do not conform to social values. Secondly, there are those who don't obey the law as they conform to the values laid down by the state. I think one must always make this distinction between civil society and state. Now, it's very easy to know, to give a conservative answer to how you should deal with the individual who won't obey the law. You punish him, and you make sure he does obey it, if you can. But those who do not conform to the prevailing social values, the mores of the society, pose a far deeper and more difficult, recalcitrant problem. There is obviously a difference between the libertarian and the conservative approaches to such a person. The libertarian would say that provided somebody obeys the law, whatever else he does is his own concern. It's never quite as simple as that, because of course it'll always involve others. Others can get harmed, but the business of the law is to ensure that others are protected from the each individual's pursuit of his own values. So that if he does harm others, then that should be against the law what he's doing. I think the Conservative has a more comprehensive view of their attitude to social deviance and wrongdoing. I think I would certainly take the view that certain kinds of behaviour ought to be subject to social disapproval and even ostracism, even though they're not necessarily against the law. For instance, the abandoning of children by their parents, the easy attitude to divorce, and the neglecting of responsibilities in the family, and also responsibilities to one's immediate community. These things should not be just simply regarded as the concern of the individual. He shouldn't simply be allowed to do this without any fear of sanction. In my view, it is right and good and proper that people should gang up against the miscreant and make him really feel what he's doing. Of course, these social pressures are not the concern of the state. The state simply imposes and enforces the law, but it is the business of society to interfere with and meddle with and be curious about the wrongdoing of one's neighbours.
Thank you very much. How do you account for the increasing influence of libertarian and free market ideas worldwide in recent years?
Free market and libertarian ideas have naturally come to the fore in recent years, first of all because of the failure of socialism to provide what it promised, namely a new and just order of society in which everybody's needs would be answered to. But secondly, because people are just fed up with the interference from the state. The state has taken things so far that it seems to have become the enemy of society instead of the friend. Instead of being the guardian and protector of communities, it seems to have taken on the impertinent role of trying to remake communities and order them in its own utopian images. I think this is really what people have revolted against. The old social instinct has reasserted itself, the desire for a society which is spontaneous, which comes out of what we want and what we are, rather than a society which is made for us and imposed by half-baked intellectuals.
Thank you very much. You have regarded Professor Hayek's theory of spontaneous order as providing a philosophical underpinning of conservatism. Yet Hayek does not regard himself as a conservative, and his theories are seen by libertarians as providing support for their ideas. How do you explain this?
Hayek's theory of spontaneous order has obviously a large liberal component in it. That's to say, he believes, and I agree with him, that some of the most important institutions in society emerge naturally and spontaneously from our cooperative endeavours. This is true of the market. It's also true of law, at least certain systems of law, like our own common law, which emerge spontaneously from the attempt to do justice in the circumstances of human conflict. And I agree with Professor Hayek that institutions which emerge spontaneously in this way are always much more stable, much more wise, and much more worthy of protection than institutions which are imposed by some plan or scheme. But I don't regard this as merely a liberal position. It has clearly got large conservative elements in it, because a spontaneous order doesn't simply last for one generation. On the contrary, it's something which involves, as Burke would put it, the dead and the unborn as well as the living. It's something which stretches across time, and creates a tradition. And it's the safeguarding of a traditional order which is the real concern of conservatives, as opposed to the liberals' desire to remake for each generation a new social order in terms of its own temporary agreements.
Do you see Marxism as a declining intellectual force in modern society, and if so, what ideas do you think will replace it?
The history of Marxism is an extremely interesting one. Marxism only became a force in the modern world because of communism and Lenin's brilliant invention of the so-called democratically centralist party. As to say, the party organised from above and imposed upon all its members with an iron discipline. I think that the Communist Party has lost all credibility. Doesn't mean it's lost power. On the contrary, it still controls the biggest military machine that the world knows. But as a real political force, therefore, Marxism will not be in the future what it has been for the past 70 years. Funnily enough, however, as an intellectual force, although it is dead wherever communism has been imposed on people, it is still alive in the minds of many Western intellectuals. There isn't actually very much evidence that Marxism has lost its grip intellectually. If you look at American universities, by and large, in humanities departments and also social science and legal departments, Marxism is still a powerful force. It's a powerful force partly because universities are so isolated from reality that these peculiar diseases can linger there. But it's also a powerful force because it gives to frustrated intellectuals an illusion of their own power in a world which, thank God, denies them power. So I suspect that Marxism will go on as a force in the intellectual world because it answers to this fantasy and to this emotional need.
Thank you very much. What would you say to the view expressed, for example, in postmodernism, that society, the economy and intellectual thought can no longer be subject to one dominant idea and method?
Postmodernism is a bit of a dog's dinner, really, isn't it? Doesn't really mean anything. It's simply a label for all those theories, some of them sensible, some of them not, which have filled the vacuum left by the collapse of modernism. Modernism, it's best to define modernism first. Modernism, as I take it, was the belief that that society and also the human condition had changed so much with the loss of religious belief that everything had to be made anew, and that the future was our own invention and that was beckoning to us to make it properly. Modernism was a huge raging force in the arts, especially in the first part of this century, because people momentarily felt optimistic that they could make the future in their own image and make it better than the past had been. Now people realise what a mess has been made, and in particular people realise that the areas where modernism was most successful, like architecture, it created the greatest of all catastrophes. People obviously wanted to move on to something else, so whatever they've moved on to, they've called postmodernism. Some of the things are sensible, and some of the things are not. But the idea associated with those postmodernist literary critics like Derrida and so on, that there is no method, there is no subject matter of any inquiry, and there's no principles with which to treat it. That to me is pure charlatanism. It's as true as it has ever been that there is an objective truth about the human condition, and it's still there for us to discover it.
Thank you very much. What individual freedoms would you find acceptable within a conservative society?
Conservative societies have always esteemed the idea of individual freedom. After all, Britain is the most Britain has the most successful tradition of conservative politics in all modern societies, and also, I think, is rightly thought to be the country in which individual freedom has the strongest safeguards. I would have thought that freedom of the individual from arbitrary arrest, economic freedom, freedom to go about one's business undisturbed, provided one is acting within the bounds of common decency and the law, that these are the most important freedoms and that we have them. I don't think, however, that they are made any stronger or given any greater guarantee by being written down or built into a Bill of Rights or made part of a constitution. On the contrary, I think these freedoms have been protected in Britain partly because they've never been written down. They're simply assumed. They're part of the day-to-day procedure of our ordinary social life, and that's the way I think they should remain.
Since the time of Burke's criticisms of the French Revolution, Western conservatives have placed a great emphasis on Christianity as a form of providing social cohesiveness. To what extent would you maintain this tradition?
Well, the question of religion in the modern world is an extremely difficult one, and especially the question of Christianity and its role in those societies which were formed by it. I think that it is unquestionable that all that liberals esteem in Western societies, all the features that they esteem, like the rule of law, the sanctity of the individual, the general ability to compromise and to regulate our affairs by agreement rather than by coercion, that all these things come to us from the Christian religion ultimately. Look around the world, you'll find that wherever these values are maintained, there is also a Christian tradition in the background. So I think that even liberals must be very wary of any social developments which abolished the primary role that the Christian churches have played in forming and regulating the societies in which we live. But of course, this doesn't mean that they can play the same role in the modern world, where people are more sceptical of religious doctrine and also more materialistic in their outlook. My own view is that it is for the churches, not for the state, to maintain a vigilant presence in society and reinforce their message and make sure that it is still there in the background of people's consciousness. Once that message goes, once it is no longer part of the social and literary inheritance of the ordinary child, then I think that we will shortly see the end of the freedoms that we've known.
Edge of the gate then.
Come on. Come on.
They decided to behave like angels. Yeah, okay.